President Trump opened a Pandora's box of legal questions when he declared a national emergency in order to fund his border wall.
Living here today, both immigrant and U.S. born, everybody's going to be happy.
Can future presidents, perhaps Democratic ones, issue similar orders over climate change, or guns, or minimum wages? And what does the national emergency say about the separation of powers between the executive and legislative branches? We might get answers soon. Some 16 states just sued the federal government over the national emergency, setting up a big legal battle with the White House.
We're at the very beginning of, I think, what's going to be a fairly drawn-out and extensive litigation process. I don't even think we've seen all of the lawsuits that we're eventually going to see arising out of the president's actions.
According to Vladek, most of the legal arguments fall into two categories. The first kind might force the courts to litigate the facts on the ground, basically asking the courts to decide whether what's happening on the U.S. border with Mexico is actually a national emergency. The second track gets into the nuts and bolts of the National Emergencies Act, the law that President Trump is using in this specific instance.
Some of these lawsuits are challenging the validity of the emergency itself and whether the president was justified in invoking the National Emergencies Act. And then I think some of these lawsuits are also looking much more specifically at the effects of the emergency declaration and the specific statutory authority the president has unlocked by declaring a national emergency, especially this military construction statute, Section 2808 of Title 10. Some of the lawsuits have both of those claims, some of the lawsuits have other claims, but to me, I think those are the two big ones to keep an eye on.
To better understand what's happening, let's head back to September 1976. President Gerald Ford had just beat out Ronald Reagan in the GOP primary, and the Viking 2 spacecraft had just landed on Mars. Congress also had just passed the National Emergencies Act. At the time, it was an attempt to limit the scope of the executive branch's emergency powers. After all, just 2 years before, President Nixon resigned in disgrace amid the Watergate scandal.
One of the real ironies about the National Emergencies Act is that when it was enacted, it was thought to be an important constraint on the president. We had lots of examples prior to 1976 of emergency declarations for all kinds of purposes. And so Congress tried to create at least procedural regularity for national emergencies by basically bringing them all within the aegis of the single statute by requiring the president to formally declare these emergencies in the Federal Register, by having emergencies expire after 1 year if the president didn't reauthorize them or redeclare them, and by creating a mechanism for Congress for the first time to terminate a national emergency before that 1 year was up, even before the president had decided whether to reauthorize it or not. What's happened since, I think, and what hasn't been appreciated until the last couple of months, is that the termination mechanism, really got watered down in the 1980s. So as initially enacted, the statute would have allowed a termination of a national emergency upon a majority vote of both houses, what's called a concurrent resolution, with no input from the president. After a Supreme Court decision held that this kind of legislative veto is unconstitutional, Congress, I think rightly, revisited the National Emergencies Act, but I think wrongly replaced that prior termination mechanism with a much more onerous mechanism where now not only do you need both houses of Congress, but you need the president. And so if the president vetoes a termination resolution, and President Trump has said he would if Congress terminates this emergency, you need an override in Congress, which means 2/3 of both houses. So at the time it was enacted, I think the statute was meant as a constraint. I think because of the dilution of the termination mechanism, it's now not nearly as much of a constraint as the draft of the statute wanted and would have intended 43 years ago.
More than 30 of the 59 national emergencies declared since 1976 are still in effect. Things like freezing assets for terrorists or drug traffickers are examples of ongoing, quote, national emergencies, as is the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. What happens next? The fight over Trump's national emergency declaration could go in several different directions and all at the same time. There's a short-term legislative effort to block the current emergency declaration. There's long-term efforts to reform the National Emergency Act itself, and there's the potential for at least one of the ongoing lawsuits to end up before the Supreme Court.